How you guys doing?
Good.
Good. All right, good. Awesome. So I'm a few minutes late. Stuff happens. All right. Do you have any questions about the Coles and Bogart paper that we were talking about last time? All right, then we will proceed. So this next section from the physiological ecology portion of the textbook deals with temperature relations, and we've already talked about how amphibians and reptiles are ectotherms, and as a result, they get their body temperature essentially from their surroundings, from environmental temperatures that they come into contact with. And this poses challenges to them, both in terms of maintaining their body temperature at a level that is high enough that they function adequately, but also avoiding temperatures that are so high that it eventually kills them. And so in all cases, these individuals are having to manage both heat gain, gaining enough heat to function, and heat loss in terms of heat gain and gaining enough to function, but not gaining so much that they die, and then heat loss, staying warm enough over long enough periods of the day that they can maintain normal activity during the course of the day. So in terms of kind of broader things that I want you guys to take out of this section on temperature is this idea that as ectotherms, they are dependent upon their external environment for regulating their body temperature. Their body temperature is regulated not through metabolic heat, but through, once again, environmental heat. And understand what challenges this raises for individuals who are ectotherms, but then also thinking about what mechanisms they have to overcome these challenges. Many of these mechanisms are behavioral in nature, and the goal of an organism on any given day is to maintain their body temperature within that optimal range. Remember last time we talked about this figure here, where as temperature increases, physiological performance increases. But it only increases to some point, and at that point, you've kind of reached maximal physiological performance, and there's kind of a range of temperatures over which you can maintain that maximum physiological performance. And if you get colder than that temperature range, your physiological performance goes down because your chemical reactions are slowing. And if you go above that range, you die essentially. And so there's this optimal temperature range right here that I'm trying to point to with my camera. I would be a terrible weather person. That optimal range, organisms want to stay in that optimal range as much as they can during the day, because it's in that range that they're going to be able to digest food best, escape predators best, find mates best, et cetera, et cetera. And if they're outside of that range, they're going to be doing all of those things at a reduced capacity. So that's the big goals. What are the challenges? How do these individuals cope? And within that coping, how well are they able to maintain these optimal temperatures? And that's what the bulk of today and Wednesday is going to be about. Remember that we do not have lab on Thursday because nobody's supposed to have any classes on Thursday because that's a spring break day. And we won't have class on Friday because I am not going to be here. Questions about any of that? Okay. I should actually make this a little more viewable to you. So imagine Actually, I should share my screen altogether, shouldn't I? Didn't realize I hadn't done that. So all you missed on the last screen was heat gain and heat loss. And so this is a collared lizard. This is Crotophytus choleratus. This is a specimen from down in the Wichita Mountains of southwestern Oklahoma. This is a place where a particular variety of collared lizard exists. The collars are a little less pronounced on this particular population. They tend to have these bright yellow markings on the head, and their body tends to be this almost turquoisey greenish color. And they're just among the prettiest colored lizards that I know of. And if you've not been to the Wichita Mountains, I highly recommend going there. They have decent campgrounds, lots of hiking, and lots of cool herps, as well as cool mammals and birds and things like that as well. So imagine that this animal is out on the landscape and is attempting to thermoregulate. And let's assume that this individual is facing the sun. So somewhere above, let's pretend that this animal is looking directly into the sun, although this is kind of a semi-cloudy day because he's also not casting much of a shadow. But imagine that there is a sun over here. What are all of the ways in which this animal can gain and lose heat?
It can gain heat by sitting in the sun and like soaking in the sunlight.
Okay, so this guy can just go out into the sun and bask. Actually, this was kind of a cloudy day when I took this photo, and this guy was doing his best to bask because it was kind of cloudy, and he was having trouble finding patches of open sun in which to raise his body temperature. So that's a way that this animal could gain heat. What are some other ways that this animal can be regulating its body temperature?
The way that it's like in contact with the ground, the ground could be acting as a sink, or if like the ground is warmer, it could be a way for the lizard to warm up. And then it's also like spreading its belly out.
Yeah, so when you look at the posture of this individual, it looks like he's pressing himself against the rock. And that's probably because on this particular day, air temperatures were on the coolish side, but there was also intermittent sun. If that intermittent sun warmed up this rock, it could be warming its body by pressing its belly down onto the rock, basically through conduction from the surface. It could be absorbing heat from the rock, and that may explain why it's pressing its body down. If, on the other hand, this rock was in the shade under a tree or something like that, and this lizard was overheating, it could actually run to that rock that is cooler than the rocks that are out in the open sun, and it could press its body against that rock, and it could actually transfer heat from its body to the rock via conduction as well. So certainly conduction is one of the ways in which they can regulate heat. What are some other ways?
You kind of already mentioned this, but the orientation towards the sun and like changing the surface area available will change how much solar radiation it's taking in.
Yep. So the position towards the sun. So I told you, imagine that this guy is facing the sun. If this guy was facing the sun, would that tend to reduce solar gain or increase solar gain?
Reduce. 'Cause
Yeah,
maybe-
that would tend to reduce solar gain. Kelsey, where would the sun need to be if this animal was attempting to increase solar gain?
You would want to have like more surface area of the body within the sunlight. So like
Yeah.
sideways, yes.
Yeah, so the sun would have to be in the upper left over here. That would be then taking his flattened exposure and raised front in here and putting the most surface area in the path of the incoming photons of light. And that would be a posture that would enable solar gain. So the cross-sectional exposure of the animal to the incoming sun, these postures that you have while basking can either serve to increase your heat gain or decrease your heat gain depending upon how much surface area you're exposing to the sunlight. What else? So we mentioned basking, conduction, area exposed. What happens to this individual if he gets too hot out in the bright sun? This was also borne out in Coles and Bogart stuff that we talked about last time.
Going somewhere shady or like don't they dig and kind of like go deeper into the ground?
Yeah, so if you get too hot, you can actually just locomote your way out of it by going in and taking shelter under the shade of a bush, taking shelter under a rock, taking shelter in a burrow. That would be ways of getting out of the way of increasing solar gain. But because those areas are also cooler, you could not only reduce your amount of solar gain, but you could also increase the amount of heat that you lose by coming into contact with these cooler substrates, cooler environments. So the things that we're describing for the most part are all behavioral in one way or another. And so when we think of ectotherms trying to regulate their body temperature, we need to think in terms of behavioral thermoregulation. So this energy balance equation that is given in your textbook basically tries to quantify all of the ways in which heat is gained or lost from the individual. So if we think about the total energy gained, total heat energy gained, there's this absolute Q, which is the radiation that is absorbed by the surface of the animal, and there's quite a lot that goes into that. Then that's strictly heat gain from the sun. But then you have metabolic heat production, which they do have some metabolic heat production. So if you catch a lizard right after you've engaged in a long chase, you've been chasing this lizard down, it's been running, keep in mind, look at the size of the muscles on the back leg of this animal. This is one of those species that can run bipedally, has very long, stout front leg or hind legs compared to the front legs. And they generate quite a lot of energy when they're running, and that can raise their body temperature. So once again, metabolic heat production would tend to increase the temperature, but then all of the rest of these things can either serve to increase the heat that the organism has or decrease it. So infrared radiation received or emitted by the surface of the animal, so heat that is basically radiated out into the environment. Convection, which is heat gain or loss by convection to the air around the animal, if it's a terrestrial organism, or the fluid around the organism, if it's an aquatic organism. So convection between the animal and fluid environments, heat gained by condensation or lost by evaporation. So if this animal gets too hot, you'll recall from the Coles and Bogert paper that there was a picture of a desert iguana with its mouth open, panting, losing heat through evaporative water loss from the lungs. And so this is what that would be about. You can also gain heat by bringing water in. And then heat gain or loss by conduction through direct physical contact with substrate it's resting on. So some of these we mentioned as we were thinking about this color lizard in Oklahoma. Others of these we didn't come up with. But here is an example of a Nematophorus, or an Aspidicilus rather, an Aspidicilus lizard, a race runner in a desert in the southwestern US. And so you find these animals in complex environments. You can get direct solar radiation. This is what the absolute Q is about. That is influenced by the posture, the way in which the organism orients itself to the sun. It can be influenced by the color of the skin of the animal, the time of day and what the angle of incidence of the sun is striking the lizard in terms of it's a low angle of incidence. If it's early in the day, it's a higher angle of incidence. If it's in the midday, and then low angle of incidence once again in the evening. Evaporation, infrared radiation being emitted or received by the individual. You can receive that radiation as a direct result of being in the presence of sunlight. You can also get infrared radiation reflecting off of rocks, even rocks that you're not pressed up against. You can get conduction through the substrate. You can get convection to the air. All of these things are aspects of heat that animals will take advantage of. If you get too hot, you go into the shade or you crawl up underneath a rock. If you get too cold, you can come back out into the sunlight and warm yourself back up. So a lot of times if you sit around and watch lizards, you will see them shuttling in and out of different microclimates in their environment. And so they're active in their thermoregulation. Sit in the sun for a while, go to the shade. Then in the shade too long, go back out to the sun. Early in the morning, as rocks warm up, if there's a rock in the sun and you're in your cold burrow, you might stay in your cold burrow until you think that rock has warmed up enough, and then you might run across to that rock and just plaster your body up against that rock to warm up through conduction and also through absolute Q until your body temperature is now high enough that you can kind of take on normal activities. Have any of you guys ever been to the Dallas Zoo in Dallas, Texas? If you ever go to Dallas and find yourself at the Dallas Zoo, if you go to the herpetarium, the amphibian reptile house there at the Dallas Zoo, right in front of it, they have this deep pit that's surrounded by a railing. And in this deep pit, there's just a big pile of boulders stacked up. And when I was in grad school, we went to the Texas Herpetological Society meetings that were held in Dallas. And one of the things they did was they gave a tour of the amphibian reptile house there at the Dallas Zoo. And it was early in the morning, and we were waiting for the tour to begin. And as the sun was climbing up above the trees and everything, you saw the sun start to hit these boulders that were down in this pit. And as that started to happen and that environment started to warm up, what we didn't realize before was that pit was full of lizards. And these lizards started coming out, emerging from their burrows and emerging from underneath boulders and stuff that were in the exhibit. And they were coming out and they started basking. After they warmed up, they started chasing insects. They started chasing one another. And we got to sit there and watch these animals go through the process of behavioral thermoregulation in an effort to warm up their bodies to the point that they can begin to interact with prey, interact with one another, et cetera, at the beginning of the day. It was actually quite fun to just sit there and watch this community of lizards in a captive setting go through their early morning rituals of getting their body temperature up to functional levels. It was kind of fun. So this is the life of a lizard, or a snake for that matter, in these complex thermoregulatory environments. So when we think about this absolute Q, how much solar gain you're getting directly from the sun, well, that is dependent upon the intensity of the solar radiation. So if it's wintertime in the northern hemisphere, the sun just in general, even at noon, is lower in the sky than it would be. One of the things about the sun being lower in the sky and patterns of solar radiation and its intensity globally is if you imagine the Earth like this, and the sun is way far away, such that by the time photons from the sun reach the Earth, it's productive to think of all of the rays of the sun hitting the Earth at essentially a right angle to the equator at the equinox. Well, there is a layer of atmosphere around the Earth, and I've drawn it much thicker than it actually is, but there are a number of things that influence the intensity of solar radiation. If the solar radiation is entering the atmosphere at a 90-degree angle, most of that solar radiation penetrates the atmosphere and reaches the surface. Now, as it's going through the atmosphere, it's going through all sorts of changes. For example, solar radiation can be scattered by dust and absorbed by dust and clouds and things like this, which reduces the total amount of solar radiation getting to the surface. And clearly, if you're at a higher latitude, so if this is the North Pole and this is the South Pole, if you're at a higher latitude, any solar radiation entering the Earth goes through more atmosphere at higher latitudes than at lower latitudes, simply because of the angle at which it's striking the Earth at that point. And so this distance is much greater than this distance. And so any scattering and absorption from things in the atmosphere that are going to happen are more pronounced at higher latitudes than lower latitudes. The same thing occurs at sunrise and sunset for any given point on the Earth. At sunrise, the sun is very low in that sky. As a result, it's passing its light to you through the thickest amount of atmosphere during the day. As the sun climbs in the sky throughout the day and it's more above you, it's going through less atmosphere as it comes to you. This is why sunsets and sunrises are usually so much prettier than midday sun, because it's actually passing through a thicker layer of atmosphere. So that happens at any given point throughout the day, but it also happens latitudinally across the Earth. The other thing that happens is when you are getting sunlight at the equator here, if you imagine a 1 meter squared block of sunlight, square of sunlight coming at you, when that 1 meter squared block of sunlight comes at you at the equator, it hits the ground as a 1 meter squared block of sunlight. But as that 1 meter square of sunlight comes to you in upper latitudes, that sunlight gets spread out over a much larger area because, once again, of the fact that you live on an oblate spheroid. And so the photons that are in that 1 square meter of light coming to you through space get spread out over a larger surface area of the surface of the Earth, such that you have lower photon density. Fewer photons per meter squared means less heat, which means it's harder for an animal to achieve solar gain. In addition, the atmosphere around the Earth is a fluid, essentially. It's a fluid air. Air is a fluid. And in the same way that light bounces off water, light also bounces off air whenever you have light moving from a less viscous fluid to a more viscous fluid. So if you're out at sunrise or sunset, you see all these nice reflections on the surface of the water. And that's because the sun is low in the sky. You see a pond, you're standing here, and those photons are coming, they're hitting the water. Some of that light penetrates, but more of that light actually gets reflected off of the surface because of the angle that that light is hitting the surface. At noon, that light is going directly down, and a lot of it is penetrating, and very little of it is actually being reflected back. Once again, because of the angle at which it's striking that surface. Well, the same thing happens here at high latitudes. A certain amount of light will penetrate, but a lot of the light will actually just reflect off of the upper surfaces of the atmosphere, because in terms of a fluid environment, space is a much less dense fluid environment than the atmosphere is. Whereas at the equator, once again, a lot of this light will actually just penetrate the atmosphere, and very little of it actually gets reflected. So for all of these reasons, given times of day, you can get more solar radiation gain than other kinds of times of day, and also where you happen to be on the Earth in terms of latitude will affect the amount of intensity of solar radiation that you get. So when we think about this absolute Q, the intensity of solar radiation is variable across the surface of the Earth, and it's also variable throughout the day, depending on what time of day it is that you're out. Obviously, larger animals have more surface area to gather heat than small animals do. This view factor is what Kelsey, I think, was talking about when we think about how the animal has oriented its body towards the sun. You can orient your body in ways that if you're facing the sun, you're reducing how much area you're exposing to the sun, versus if you're facing away from the sun, you're increasing the amount of surface area that you're exposing to the sun. So even an animal with a set surface area can influence how much of that surface area is being exposed to the sun by altering what biologists refer to as view factor. And then, of course, there's the issue of absorptivity of solar radiation. How much of the solar radiation that strikes the surface area is actually observed by the animal rather than reflected. That's going to be influenced by things like color of the animal. Darker animals tend to have more absorptivity than lighter animals. And that all goes into this one thing that is in this complicated equation looking at the amount of heat energy that is gained. View factor, this is what Kelsey was talking about. Neutral orientation, a positive orientation increasing the amount of surface area, and a negative orientation which decreases the amount of solar radiation, the amount of surface area that is available for solar gain. And so once again, this is a horned lizard, which tends to be a dumpy flat lizard. And so view factor is highly manipulable in horned lizards compared to maybe some other more cylindrically shaped lizards. And I can't find my model of horned lizard, but you guys have a horned lizard up in lab, and you can see how its body shape might facilitate it gaining heat by just altering view factor. Organisms can change body color. Remember that the melanophores rather, from back when we were talking about skin structure in test 1 material, remember that melanophores are these cells down in the dermis of the animal, but they have cytoplasmic extensions that extend up into the epidermis of the skin. And what they can do is they can move around the presence of melanin from the lower levels of the cell into these dendritic processes that go up into more shallow layers of the skin. And as a result of this, they can actually alter their coloration. And so this is once again a desert iguana, Dipsosaurus dorsalis, from the desert Southwest. This is a darker organism that is probably on the cooler side. As it has cooled down, it has change the distribution of melanin within the melanophores, move that melanin closer to the surface, making it darker, which increases its absorptivity and causes it to gain heat in terms of absolute Q faster than it would be if it were in a lighter phase where it's taken those melanophores and translocated that melanin down deeper into the skin. This is also a frog doing a similar sort of thing. Dark when it's cool, as it warms up on the substrate, it then translocates melanin to reduce solar gain and become more reflective. When we think of thermoregulation, there are three types of thermoregulation that we can kind of classify behaviors into. There's heliothermy, thigmothermy, and kleptothermy. Do you guys remember from your reading what each of these different terms mean? What does heliothermy refer to?
It should be sun, like relying solely on the radiation from the sun, and then thigmothermy should be relying on conduction from whatever the substrate is.
Yep. Okay, so heliothermy is absorbing solar radiation directly from the sun. Basking would be an example of heliothermy. Thigmothermy is basically sigmo, it means touch. So it's thermoregulation via touch. And so it's exactly what Elizabeth said, which is basically pressing your body up against something and gaining heat or losing heat for that matter through coming into contact with the substrate. What is kleptothermy?
Isn't that where they like share with another animal?
Yeah, so imagine that you're a tuatara, and you guys remember what a tuatara is? What is a tuatara? You guys remember what a tuatara is? It's in the order Rhizocephalia. Just remember where tuataras live. It's a lizard-like organism. It's a sister taxon to the Squamata. The primitive lizard-like animal. Is ringing any bells with you guys? We did cover the tuatara before, didn't we? You guys remember where it's from?
Yeah, it's from New Zealand.
It's from New Zealand. For those of you who have never been to New Zealand, I've not been to New Zealand either, although I think it would be fun to go there. As it turns out, New Zealand is a relatively cool environment. This is a cool weather organism. I might have told you the story, the story full of uninteresting and useless information about the tuataras coming to the Dallas Zoo when I was in graduate school, and their refrigerated exhibit broke down, and so they couldn't take the tuataras there, and so they brought them to the University of Texas at Arlington because we had a large, fully functional refrigerated room in the basement of the building. And so we, as graduate students, could go and visit the tuataras on a daily basis if we wanted to. So these guys are living in a relatively cold environment. but they live in many cases in areas where shorebirds also live, and some of these birds actually dig burrows and spend time down in burrows once again to stay warm in this relatively cool environment. And tuataras are one of the species that will actually cohabitate with these shorebirds. And what they gain from it is when the bird is down there producing its own metabolic heat and warming up its burrow, it's also warming the burrow up and warming the tuatara that is hunkered down inside the burrow with the bird. And so kleptothermy is exactly that. I think of a kleptomaniac. Kleptothermy is the act of thermoregulating by taking the metabolic heat from some other organism and using that metabolic heat to raise your temperature. And we see this happening in tuataras, and we see this happening in other organisms, as we'll see here in a little while. So when we think about I'm a lizard, or I'm a snake, or I'm a frog, or a salamander, and I need to regulate my body temperature, there are tons of decisions that that animal has to make from moment to moment in terms of monitoring its own internal body temperature, as well as monitoring the thermoregulatory opportunities that are in the environment in such a way that it maintains its body temperature at a relatively constant level and at a level that is within the optimal or preferred range for that particular species. So this figure basically shows body temperature on the x-axis and the kinds of decisions that an animal will make. And it ranges from basking range on the cool side of this. Basking range represents your body temperature is down at a temperature at which if you can go out and raise your temperature by doing something like basking, you will do so. Activity range means that you're warm enough that you're engaging in normal activities. You're not really spending a lot of time necessarily trying to raise temperature as much as you're trying to balance heat gain versus heat loss up in this air, up in these temperatures. And what you're also trying to do is you're trying to avoid the maximum. And so as you come out in the morning, you might change color to increase heat gain. You might change your view factor in order to gain heat. Some organisms engage in this behavior called eye bulging, where basically they exert blood pressure behind the eye to push the eyes out further. On some of these species, like certain frog species, for example, the eyes are actually quite large in some cases. And so by exposing the eyes are designed to absorb light. You can increase heat gain that way. As your body temperature rises, you might then start seeking shade. If you continue to heat up even after seeking shade, you might start to engage in panting. You might engage in cloacal discharge, basically going to the bathroom. When you release all of that water, you're releasing a lot of energy in the process, and so that's a form of evaporative cooling in a sense. You might engage in burrowing. If you're at this basking, if you're down at these cooler temperatures, you might engage in burrowing where you just stick your head out. We'll talk about countercurrent blood flow mechanisms that move blood constantly within a small area of the body. And so some organisms can burrow with their head poking out of the substrate. As their head heats up, they're just recirculating blood in the head and reducing the flow of blood from the head to the rest of the body until that blood is warmed up, and then they'll start opening up blood flow from the head to the rest of the body, and that blood that has been heated up in the head then starts to warm the rest of the body, even though the body is down in sand or dirt or something like that. So there are a lot of things that organisms can do, and they'll do some things at low temperatures, they'll do other things at high temperatures. If you're cold, you would take a positive orientation in terms of view factor. If you're warm, you would take a negative orientation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so these are the options that an animal has, and how it moves from one of these to the other depends upon what its internal environment is like, and also it depends on what the options are in the environment for it to maintain its body temperature. So this is an example from your textbook, Rhinella spinulosa, and it's showing you different things here. Air temperature in the shade. So one of the things that you'll find with air temperature in the shade is it's generally less fluctuating and also less hot than air temperature in the sun. And then we see in green the surface soil temperature, and then the dotted line, the black dotted line, is the body temperature of the toad. And what we can see from the body temperature of the toad is that it's getting a certain amount of heat gain, probably through early morning basking. So this is 6 a.m. on February 8th. It comes out, the first thing that it does is it basks in order to get its body temperature up. But after it reaches a certain point, probably leaves the sun and goes into a shady area to lower its body temperature, and its body temperature continues to decline until you get to the next morning, at which point that animal is going to go out and bask, temporarily raise its body temperature, but then that animal will go probably once again into a shady area or into a burrow, and it will continue to exist at relatively low body temperatures, considering that this is February, and so it's not very, very warm at all. And then once again, there was a shady day when the sun wasn't out at all, and this animal really was stuck in the shade. And as a result, you can see that its body temperature is really just tracking air temperature or soil temperature when it's probably down in a burrow during the day. Most toads are most active at night, and so you're going to see this body temperature spike in the morning as it's finishing up its night and getting some increased body temperature, but then it's going into a burrow, and the body temperatures are kind of conforming to either shade temperatures or, as we can see here, burrow temperatures. So if you're studying the thermoregulation of a species, one of the things that you have to do is you have to not only know what the body temperature is of the organism, you also have to know what the temperatures are of all of the places that it might go to help it thermoregulate. And that can become quite challenging, monitoring all of these different microhabitats for temperature. So Ray Huey is a guy that I know at the University of Washington. I think he's retired now or semi-retired now, but he still does a lot of work. He was one of these people who back in the 1980s really got into thermoregulation. Chuck Peterson is a guy at the University of Idaho now, or sorry, Idaho State rather. He specializes in implanting radio transmitters in organisms and then using radio transmitters to tell you things about the life of those organisms. When I was in grad school, me and a friend of mine went to his lab and were taught how to use radio transmitters in snakes by one of his students. We spent a couple of weeks up there in Idaho during the winter of 1992 or something like that. Steve Arnold is a snake ecologist who was at the University of Chicago and is now at the University of Oregon Oregon State rather, in Corvallis. And then Warren Porter is an old snake ecologist. They got together and they recognized the difficulty of quantifying the temperature of the organism as well as the temperature of the microenvironments of the organism. And so they basically took kind of an experimental approach to this. They published this paper in Ecology in 1989 called Hot Rocks and Not So Hot Rocks, looking at garter snakes and their thermoregulatory behavior. And what they did basically was they put temperature sensitive radio transmitters in snakes so that they can know what the body temperature of the snake was. And they had snake 1 and snake 2, just as two examples here. This is the hour of the day from midnight to the following midnight. And you can see that during the night, the body temperature is slowly going down in the snake because this snake is sequestered in a burrow, basically trying to keep its body as warm as it can be at a time when air temperatures are falling. Then as the animal comes out of its burrow, it immediately raises its body temperature through basking. But the striking thing is this animal is able to maintain its body temperature within its preferred body temperature range for a large portion of the day. And it's accomplishing this through active thermoregulation. And so the open circles are when it's exposed on the surface, and the closed circles are when it's under a rock. And so it warms up probably through heliothermy during the day, during the early parts of the day, and then maintains its body temperature through sigmathermy by going underneath rocks that have gained enough solar heat that it provides a stable, warm environment for them until once again the sun goes down and then the entire environment begins to cool off, at which point those rocks that have warmed up during the day also begin to cool off, and they start to cool off throughout the night. Well, this only makes sense if you are also monitoring the environmental temperatures. So what they did was they put out a bunch of thermocouples under different size rocks. This is a 4 centimeter diameter rock versus a 43 centimeter diameter rock. They have thermocouples at the edge and at the center, and you can see that large rocks fluctuate less in temperature than small rocks do, but small rocks can get very, very hot during the hottest parts of the day. So you wouldn't want to necessarily find yourself underneath a small rock at the hottest part of the day, because it's going to be way above your critical thermal max temperature. But you also don't want to just hang out underneath a large rock, because the large rock never gets warm enough during the day to put you into your preferred temperature range. And so what you might actually want to do is you might want to actually be under intermediate sized rocks. So this is a 5 centimeter rock that is within the preferred body temperature range during a good chunk of the latter part of the day, although it takes this 5 centimeter rock quite a long time to warm up, much longer than even a 4 centimeter rock. And also, depending on where you are, if you're under a 30 centimeter rock and you're at the south edge, you're much warmer than if you're at the east edge or in the center of the rock. And then you can also quantify the temperature of an operant model on the surface of the environment. And so what an operative model is it's usually a piece of copper tubing that you've painted to resemble the reflectance of the snake or lizard that you're working with. So you'll take a copper tubing that is of the approximate same diameter, and then you'll paint it in a color pattern that kind of matches the reflectivity of the animal. And you'll set that out on the landscape in full sun with a thermocouple inside of it, and that thing will fluctuate. And it's the equivalent of Coles and Bogart essentially tethering an animal in the sunlight. And so rather than tethering an animal, you put an operative model of an animal in the sunlight, and then you see how that thing heats up, because that thing is not shuttling back and forth between sun and shade and on the surface versus under a rock versus in a burrow, etc. So they did their best to quantify the thermal environment, and then they basically created sort of biophysical models of different kinds of rocks. And they used this biophysical model to then predict, well, what would happen if you were the most well-evolved snake on the planet from the standpoint of thermoregulation? That's what they're calling the Panglossy snake. If you want to know what Panglossy is about, I can tell you, but it's kind of an involved story and you don't really need to know. But this is a snake that is able to thermoregulate perfectly within the environment that it is faced with. And what you can see is that it goes long periods of the day in its preferred temperature range, and that preferred temperature range extends almost all the way through the night. And it's only here at the very end of the night, early parts of the morning, that it can't find an environment within its preferred temperature range. These are the two snakes that they monitored, and you can see that one of them is doing a pretty good job, one of them is doing a less good job. But then they contrast that with what would happen if a snake stayed in each of these environments throughout the entirety of the day. How much of the day would it be able to maintain its body temperature and its preferred temperature range? And none of these environments really provide much of a good environment, except for the 30 centimeter rock. because once again, in this 30-centimeter rock, you have a lot of variation underneath that 30-centimeter rock, because you can be near the south edge, you could be near the east edge, or you could be near the center, and there's a lot of variation in body temperature underneath a single rock, which is why that rock turns out to be a pretty good place to be. And that rock matches almost perfectly what a perfectly thermoregulating snake would experience. So in this particular environment, the place you want to be is under a medium to large sized rock. Not the largest rock out there, but certainly not the smallest rock out there, because it just gets way too hot and way too cold. Way too hot during the main part of the day and way too cold after you lose solar gain. So this was an important paper because it was one of the first times that people really attempted to thoroughly quantify the thermal environment that these snakes have available to them, and then ask questions about how they're utilizing this. And what they found was that snakes are coming out, exposing themselves early in the day to increase heat gain, and then they're going underground during the hardest part of the day to avoid too much heat gain. But they're doing that in ways that they're going underneath rocks that not only allow them to avoid temperatures that are too high, but also allow them to avoid temperatures that are too cold. Going back to this, on the surface, underneath rocks, and based on the temperature profiles of rocks, these are intermediate to large size rocks. All right, questions about that? Okay, so here's another figure from your book, and this is a breeding aggregation of frogs, and I don't remember what frogs these are. I would have to go back and look in your book, but there are also thermoregulatory consequences of the activities that you're engaged in. And so within this breeding aggregation, you can see that there's a lot of variation in the body temperatures of the frogs as males are attempting to gain access to females. And you can see that here in this kind of densest aggregation here, you see that body temperatures of these frogs are on the high side, probably because they're out in the sunlight, but they're also probably out in the sunlight because they're getting their body temperatures up. Because their body temperatures are up, they're better able to function physiologically, and that makes mating easier than if you're trying to mate over here in the shade. And you see that this is not a very big difference in terms of total space, but these guys are like over 5 degrees warmer centigrade than these guys here in the shade, even though that's probably less than a foot of physical distance. And so one of the things I want you to take from this photo is microclimate can be crucial. You can be just a few inches away and be experiencing a very different thermal environment than a conspecific of yours might be who's a few inches away from you. What are these frogs doing? What do these postures look like? What do they resemble that you've seen before?
It looks like they're like camouflaging, or like trying to hide.
Okay, so here you see a dark-faced frog, here you see a lighter-faced frog. That may be camouflage, but in terms of the posture, you've seen a posture similar to this in the past, right? With a frog.
Is it the water posture thing?
Okay, so we've talked about posture of animals from the standpoint of conserving water loss. Here's a situation where this animal could be adopting a water posture where it's reducing the surface area to volume ratio to avoid evaporation across the skin. But this is the section of the chapter that is dealing with temperature. What might this posture be accomplishing for this frog? I'm still listening.
Maybe like we talked about with the temperature of the rock, it could be trying to regulate itself that way.
Yeah, so this represents a posture wherein the animal is probably trying to gain heat, and it's gaining heat by basically taking the broad surface of its body and exposing it to the body or to the sun. You see that it's out in full sun here. So it's not trying to cool itself. It looks like it's trying to warm itself, and it's warming itself in such a way that it's presenting its broadest portion of its body to the sunlight, and it's also reducing evaporative cooling because it's also tucking in its legs. This animal is probably heated up enough and is beginning to undergo color change, and then this represents a frog that is at its normal body temperature and is resuming regular activity postures. So postures can be used for evaporative heat loss issues, but postures can also be used in terms of thermoregulation. This is a figure from your textbook, and this is of a sea crate. And so this is a sea crate that finds itself in association with the burrows of seabirds, these pelagic birds that come onto land to nest. And this happens to be a species that is in a burrow that is in association with a group of pelagic birds that dig burrows. So what would this be an example of in terms of thermoregulation? Is this going to be heliothermy? Is this going to be sigmathermy? Or is this going to be kleptothermy?
It'll be kleptothermy.
It'll be kleptothermy. So here you see the red line, which is the surface of the beach where the sea crate. So a sea crate is one of the sea snakes in the family Elapidae or Hydrophiidae, depending on who you talk to in terms of taxonomy. If you're on the beach, beaches, if you've ever been to the beach sand can get very, very hot in the heat of the day if you've ever been to the beach. And by the way, please don't go to the beach this week for spring break. Even though we're not having a spring break, I know some students have like jettisoned that and have taken time off and are sitting on a beach somewhere unwisely. But anyway, beach temperatures can get very, very hot. And so you wouldn't want to be a sea crate just hanging out on the beach drinking a pina colada because your body temperature would be way above your critical thermal maximum. You also don't want to be in a shearwater burrow where there's not a shearwater hanging out because that then is too cold for you. It's not below your critical thermal minimum, but it's certainly not within your preferred body temperature range. But if you're hanging out in a burrow where there is a shearwater present, you can see that over the course of a variety of days, you're able to maintain your body temperature up here in the 30 to 37 degree centigrade range, which is probably a pretty good active temperature for a sea crate. And it corresponds well with the active temperatures of the desert lizards that you saw in Coles and Bogart. So this would represent an example of kleptothermy, gaining your body temperature by essentially stealing, if you want to think of it that way, stealing body heat from an endothermic organism, down in something like a burrow. And I think we'll just leave it off there for now. And I will see you guys again on Wednesday. Do you guys have any questions about thermoregulation at this point? All right, I'm still not feeling well. We made quiche on Friday and that didn't sit very well with me. And then we took Saturday off from eating the quiche, and then we ate the quiche again last night and it didn't sit well with me, which makes me think there was something wrong with the quiche that we made. I think as I get older, I'm not as capable of handling really rich, fatty foods. So I'm probably going to be at home for office hours today. So if you have any questions, just let me know. I'll unlock the lab before I leave. So if you want to go in and do any lab work, you can do that. But otherwise, contact me via email. All right. See you guys on Wednesday.